But my father was always saying, why don't you go to work for Fidelity? Why don't you go to work for Vanguard? You can make millions and millions. And I'm like, yeah, but that just seems like too much work for me. I kind of like what I'm doing and pushing back and living where I want. And actually, right before he passed away, he said, you know what? You did it right. You could be wealthy and you didn't have to have all of those trappings of wealth. And that's when I started to learn there was a big difference between wealth and spending.
A thought came to mind I have to bring up because it sounds like you lived a little bit of a Caddyshack and Fast Times at Ridgemont High life. Would that be true?
Yeah. I like that. I'll have to use that.
Were you Spagoli?
I don't really remember the movie that well, but we definitely, I think we fit that to some degree. Yeah.
Well, you were the caddy and she was the lifeguard. It's perfect. It was a match made in heaven.
Yeah.
Hi, and welcome to Catching Up to FI, a podcast on mindset, money, life on the journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Becky, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your hosts. We're here to help you with your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting from.
We're going to talk to other late starters, experts, and we'll explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to FI together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to FI. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Becky Heptig, and today we have an exciting guest for you. I'm going to turn things over to Becky to introduce him.
Thanks, Bill. Today, we're talking to Mark Trautman, who's actually a good friend of mine and Stephen's. Mark is a great friend and contributor to the FI community. His personal finance knowledge spans a wide variety of topics, and he loves to talk all things FI. Stephen and I met Mark and his wife, Marge, at Camp FI Rocky Mountain in 2019. And we connected initially because of our desire to learn from and give back to the FI community. But then we discovered our mutual love for cars, in particular Porsches, and driving fast. Stephen and I love to drive our cars on the track, but we pale in comparison to Mark and Marge's accomplishments. Sadly, Mark lost his wife, his lovely wife, to a 2-year battle to cancer in July of 2021. After spending time processing his grief and obligations, he dove headfirst back into the FI community and attending live events. In a way, the FI community has become his new family. I think Mark and Stephen and I have attended 7 FI or FIRE events together over the last few years. He loves to make connections and he loves giving back. In fact, you can hear Mark on the Earn and Invest podcast, Mile High FI podcast, the Retirement Answer Man podcast for a month-long series just last month in March of 2023. And he and his daughter, Katie, were speakers at last year's Camp FI Rocky Mountain Week 1. He's one of the most generous people I know, and we're anxious to hear his nuggets of wisdom today. Mark Trautman, welcome to Catching Up to FI.
Oh, thank you. And I really think what you guys are doing here in this podcast is super. I think it's an audience that has really yet to be addressed. So I'm glad that you guys have launched this, and it sounds like it's off to a great start. So congratulations to both of you on this.
Well, thank you, Mark, and welcome to the show. We appreciate the support, and we've had a really warm reception, and thanks to people like yourself, and thanks for being here today.
Oh, absolutely. Love it.
All right, Mark, we need to go back a little bit just so people understand you a little bit better so they know where you're coming from. Can you give us a little bit about your background, profession, family, and financial history?
Sure. I grew up mostly in northern New Jersey, which is really kind of a suburb of New York City. So a lot of people work in the city and live in the Morristown, New Jersey area, which is where I grew up. Upper middle class family. I went to private schools, so I was kind of surrounded by families with wealth and, a lot of things. And so that was kind of, I would say, my learned mindset was kind of the money status, if you want to think of it in terms of Brad Klantz's, 4 money quadrants, where, what people had or what they drove or what they lived in was kind of a sign of their wealth, if you would say. So that was kind of our modeling. And then my wife and I, we got married. We borrowed on credit cards to pay for the wedding. We kind of learned all the wrong things. We got in credit card debt. And it was funny. We used to ski in Vermont a lot. And we were up there visiting our friends that we had made friends in the kind of ski bum community, I guess you would say, and realized that, wealth wasn't everything that you needed to have a happy life. And we were reading a ski magazine at one point, and there was a article about this ski bum and his girlfriend or wife at the time living out of a car. And they had this motto that said, earn little, spend less, invest the rest. And we're like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. Except I'm not really too keen on this earn little piece. So we kind of switched things around. And at the same time, we were reading books like The Wealthy Barber, The Millionaire Next Door, and kind of starting to learn that maybe what you have is not really what wealth is. So we rearranged those words, and our motto became make some, save and invest, and live on the rest, which was basically putting savings first and living on the difference. And then learning to save 20% of everything we earn. The Wealthy Barber starts off with saying something like, you save 10% of every dollar you earn. Same thing with like The Richest Man in Babylon, that same concept. And we decided to make that 20%. And then we learned that wealth really isn't what you see outwardly. Wealth is what you often don't see. So we started, changing our lifestyle and learning, and kind of, I would say we woke up in our minds, it was late, but for your audience, it might've been early. It was in our mid to late 20s. To us, that was kind of late. And then from that point forward, we just started compounding saving, and I ended up retiring at age 50 as a result of just basically following that script.
How did you spend your professional life, though? You have a particular interest in finance, right?
Yeah. So, living in northern New Jersey, I ended up going to work on Wall Street. I was in the financial industry. I learned kind of the ins and outs of the financial industry. It wasn't really that enamored with some of the aspects, but I did like the money management side. And that's the area that I ended up working in for my entire career. I was a portfolio manager for a small mutual fund company or a mutual fund at a small company. And that's basically what I did my entire career. So it was definitely on the investment side the whole time.
And did your wife work as well?
Yeah. So she was working in the mortgage industry. So she kind of saw all the ins and outs of all the crazy loans that were going on. And that was actually one of our early signs that maybe there was going to be an issue in the real estate market. So we ended up selling our house in 2006 as a result of, it was too large of a house for us. We had basically bought this very large house that needed a lot of work, did a ton of work to it, realized once we were done, it was more house than we needed, and decided to sell it. And once we saw all the crazy loans that were going on, and then rented for 2 years and ended up moving to Colorado in 2008 while we were renting, and had no, it was very easy to move at that point, and kind of walked in and quit my job and used the JL Collins FU card to basically say, hey, we're moving out west, and that's okay if you don't want me to work for you anymore. But they actually said, no, we'd like you to keep working for us out there. And I did until 2015. And that's when I stopped working for money.
So what we want to talk about today is how money weaves itself through relationships, and specifically couples, singles, and kids. And Mark, you've experienced all of these scenarios as a husband, a widower, and the dad to a soon-to-be college graduate with a master's degree. Congratulations, by the way. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
you're very proud of your daughter. So let's start out with couples. So in my years in the FI community, there's a few questions that seem to drop pretty often. And one of them is, how do I get my spouse on board? So let's start out talking about that. How important is it to have your spouse on, quote, the same page?
Yeah, I would say it's really important to be at least reading out of the same book, if not on the same page, right? And we kind of met each other at a very young age. We both started our lives together with nothing at the same time, so neither of us had anything. So we were on this journey from day one together. So we were really always on the same page. I was definitely the one that had my head buried in the spreadsheets, and she was more like, just tell me what we need to know kind of thing. And, we would have, monthly meetings or quarterly meetings to talk about where everything was. And she was totally on board with where we were financially, but wasn't in the weeds as much as I was on all the particulars. But we were definitely on the same page. And I think that's critical for any relationship to be able to move forward in this in this way.
So do you feel like being on the same page means that everybody is equally interested and in the weeds? You said that you were more in the weeds than she was, but that still works out okay, right? Everybody being on the same page doesn't mean you have to be alike in everything.
No, I would say what I mean by that is having shared goals, right? So one of the things I think about when I kind of rewind the clock and think back that many years, because it was a while ago, was one of the things we were like, wouldn't it be great, because we were avid skiers driving 4 hours every weekend to Vermont and, weekend warriors, right? We're like, wouldn't it be great just to have a house up here? And that's all we could do was ski, right? We're young. That's what is top of mind back then. And then we started thinking, well, what would we have to do that? How much money would we need? What kind of jobs? Because there really weren't jobs up in Vermont that would pay much. So at the time, this was in the 90s when the market was going up double digits every year. We're like, oh, so a portfolio of $1 million at 10% return would give you $100,000 a year, and that'd be plenty for a ski bum. So that was kind of our initial goal, but it was dreaming together. It was having shared ideas, whether they came to fruition or not. It gave you the reason to save and potentially, have delayed gratification or, decide, hey, we don't need to go out to dinner every night or have, we did have a nice car, but have, multiple nice vehicles. And actually we rented a house that was a piece of garbage that was really cheap. So our housing was really inexpensive. So there were certain things that we were frugal on, although we had many pairs of skis and ski clothes and stuff like that. So you could see where we were spending our money, right? Yeah, we had shared goals. And I think that is really the critical factor, is having those shared goals and dreams together to be able to, walk this path together.
I'm curious if there was a spender and a saver in the two of you, or did you align in both of those strategic goals?
So surprisingly, I was the spender. And I'm not today, right? But yeah, I was, and my wife would joke that, I was commuting to the city. It was 2 hours each way. And every Friday I would buy the new CD that I wanted to listen to that weekend. Of course, this was in the days of CDs and not streaming and so forth. But I still have hundreds of CDs from those days where literally at least I was buying at least one per week. And she was like, why do you keep buying all these things? So I was definitely a spender in that respect. And then on, ski stuff, there was like, no question. We always had to have, whatever we needed as far as skiing went. So I was actually more of the spender than she was. And I think that came from the fact that, like I said, my family is kind of upper middle class. And my father was always, he was a country club member and always was, trying to do what the next level up was doing, so the bigger house, the nicer car and so forth. And that's kind of how I grew up. Whereas my wife was more like regular middle class, and they had 5 kids in the family. There was less money around. So I think she was just naturally more frugal than I was.
So there are a lot of folks in our audience that are like us, starting late, and they may not be on the same page. They may not have ever been on the same page with their spouse, or they are, but it's a situation where they're either spenders or they haven't saved, or whatever the situation is. And like us, they woke up late and said, oh no, what do we do now? What suggestions would you have for a situation where maybe one person is a lot more excited about this SPY stuff and being frugal and all of the new things that they're bringing to the table, and the other spouse is like, wait a minute, what's wrong with what we've been doing?
Yeah, I think we see that a lot in the financial independence community, where one person is, reads, Pete's blog, Mr. Money Mustache, and it's just like, I'm all in, I'm going to do everything that he says and so forth. And, just dives so deep into it, and then brings these reams of data and spreadsheets to their partner and says, look, this is what we should be doing. And here's why, and blah, 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 and just going on and on and on. The other person can't even get a word in edgewise, right? Well, that's probably not the best approach. And that was not what we did. We kind of learned together. But I was definitely more, in line with that, diving deep and going down the rabbit hole. But I would say, take a step back and ask yourself, why are you interested in doing this? And why might your partner also be interested in doing this? Instead of bringing this, multi-page spreadsheet and laying it out on the kitchen table and looking at all these fine numbers. Scrap all that for a moment. Just have a cup of coffee and say, what's really important to us and how do we get there? And I think slowly you will both get on the same page. And of course, there probably will be one person who is more, aggressive and goes down the rabbit hole than the other. And that's usually why there's a good partnership, right? Kind of a yin and yang in a partnership. So I would just say, I really like the idea of In the Moving, Playing with Fire, where they sat down and said, write down your top 10 things that you value, for example, and then they did it independently and shared it together afterwards and realized that a lot of their lifestyle wasn't really even addressing those top 10 things. They were living in an area where one of the things that they valued most wasn't even had anything to do with where they lived and so forth. So basically, kind of dream together, but do it separately initially and then come together and think about how do we accomplish these goals together, financially and non-financially.
Yeah, my wife and I did dream together, and still dream together, but we did it differently before my wake up and subsequently her wake up. If we wanted to go on a trip, we went on the trip and we assumed the money was going to be there and we put it on a credit card and paid it off either in toto or over the next couple of months. Now we're going to Israel next year. The money is already in the bank for that trip. We're looking forward to it. Nothing's going to touch it. It's one of our sinking funds, Becky.
One of the 15. So, Bill, you have a situation where you woke up late, but you were on the same page already. So that's sort of the other side of this coin is if both partners are sort of starting on the same page and then both agree that, yes, we need to do something different, then what kinds of things do they need to be thinking about?
Well, I don't know that my wife and I were on the same page, and she definitely didn't like being lectured to. Just like Mark said, you really got to sit down and talk about shared goals. The money comes so much later, and it will be important. But initially, it's really about how do we value our marriage? Where do we want to go to? How do we share these values with our kids? And we had not done a great job of that. Our kids have become both a spendthrift and a saver, very divergent. We enabled that. We were the metaphors for a lifestyle of being rich without being wealthy. Mark talks about what you don't see is what makes you wealthy. What's invisible is what makes you wealthy. His father, it sounds like, grew up in that rich ladder. And I'm curious from Mark to hear, why didn't you end up in that same ladder?
Well, it's interesting. So my father and I understand why he did that. So his parents were immigrants. They owned a bakery in Long Island, I think it was. It really did not have much. And he was the first one to go to college and so forth. So he was always looking to move up the rung at work, or was always looking, especially the schools that I went to. I went to a very prestigious private elementary school and a very prestigious private high school. And we were just surrounded with people with huge wealth. And so it was always like, well, that's what everyone else has. That's what we should be striving towards. And, having the fancy country club and so forth. And actually, my wife and I met at that country club. So my wife was a lifeguard at the country club. And I was a member, or a member's child, really. I wasn't the member. And I also worked as a caddy. So I saw the kind of the other side of the equation as a caddy, right? I'm hanging out with all these caddies, and many of the members didn't know I was a member and treated me like crap, really. And I kind of got turned off by that. I'm like, I'm not really interested in this country club stuff. This does not seem like the kind of world I want to live in. So I started to kind of push back and think about things differently as a result of working as a caddy. I also worked at one year I decided, instead of being a caddy, because it was a lot of physical labor, that I would go to work it was actually a Cadillac dealership. And my job was to drive the people who drop their cars off to their houses. And the other thing we would do is we would go actually stretch limos, are cars that are cut. They're really physically stretched and a section is put in. So we would bring like 3 cars regular Cadillacs to the stretch place and then bring one stretch back. So it was always like who got to drive and who got to sit in the back, right? But I kind of learned a lot by seeing the other side. So the people I was hanging out with were the shop workers. And I mean, these were your, working class people. And I just kind of got a big eye opening to that side of the world. And I didn't feel like I had to be that, always going up the rung of the ladder. And the one thing I do remember my father saying, because I was always the one, now I did manage money and I did manage a mutual fund, and it sounds like this multi-million-dollar job, right? Well, mine wasn't. I worked for a very small firm. I made, a decent amount of money, but it was 100,000 to, 150,000. It wasn't a huge amounts like you hear, because everyone says, oh, portfolio manager must have made millions of dollars. No wonder you retired early. That was not the case. But my father was always saying, why don't you go to work for Fidelity? Why don't you go to work for Vanguard? You can make millions and millions. And I'm like, yeah, but that just seems like too much work for me. I kind of like what I'm doing and pushing back and living where I want. And actually, right before he passed away, he said, you know what? You did it right. So that really gave me a lot of, solace, but it also, kind of living a balanced life is always what we've tried to do. But so I think, from the outset, I never really had those ambitions to be that, living that wealthy family life. And in fact, going to these schools and seeing some of these families, many of them were very dysfunctional. Wealth definitely can make families kind of not the greatest environment. And I saw that as well. So that kind of turned me off as well.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I went to boarding school and was surrounded by exactly the same people. And I kind of dreamed in many ways to be more like them because I come from modest means. And I think I got caught up in the consumer culture. So you were surrounded by this consumer culture, the rich culture. How did you push back against this? Or how does somebody who has been enveloped by this and whose habits have all been formed by this, how do they push back? How do they change the direction of their great ship Titanic away from the iceberg?
Well, I think, you have to be an independent-minded thinker. That's one. And I think I was to some degree. But, one of the things that I think was kind of interesting where I learned my lesson of compounding. So my grandmother was the wife of a minister. Her husband passed away when he was in his early 50s. My mother was 21, the same age that my daughter was when my wife passed away. So I didn't even realize that until that happened. And my mother was talking to my daughter and say, I lost my dad at the same age. And I was like, wow, I didn't even realize she was that young. But anyway, so she was a minister's wife, didn't have a job. And fortunately, the church paid for her housing. And her husband had like a $3,000 life insurance policy. And I think it was her brother-in-law was a stockbroker or something and said, oh, well, instead of just putting it in a CD, why don't you buy these three companies? One was Atlanta Gas Light, so a utility company. Another one was some other utility, I don't remember. And the third was Coca-Cola. So with her $1,000 of the $3,000, she bought Coca-Cola. And when she passed away, or when she was older and in a nursing home, she told me the story, and I actually have this little piece of paper where she wrote out all the shares. She bought 9 shares initially for $1,000, and it turned into some, I don't know, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars now. And she wasn't even reinvesting the dividends. She was just looking for the dividends as income. But that was my lesson in compounding. And here was a woman that literally was, living fine, but, didn't have a lot of means. And so I realized that you could be wealthy and you didn't have to have all of those trappings of wealth. And that's when I started to learn there was a big difference between wealth and spending. But that was just kind of one of those life lessons that, all the little pieces kind of fall together over time to make who you are.
It sounds like you and your wife were equally focused on the big rocks that we refer to as housing, transportation, and food. Did you ever have any disagreements over the big rocks, or was it just the ski equipment?
Well, I would say the transportation we weren't really good at because we really did like our nice cars. So that was one piece that we didn't do very well at. But we were always focused on, as long as we saved 20% minimum, and in many cases it was 30% of our gross income. So I do calculate it based on gross as opposed to net. that we could spend the difference, and we were fine. And we did spend more on cars as a percentage of the normal than maybe some people would. But our housing was always a piece that we did keep low. So initially we rented this really junky house, and it was a real rundown, and we ended up cleaning it up, making it nice. And the landlord was happy because he was like, he never wanted us to leave because became this great place. But we did. We actually moved in with her mother after we started figuring out, hey, we really need to get paid down all this credit card debt that we had because of the wedding and some other things and skiing. And so we moved into her house because she needed to sell her home. She was divorced, got the house in the settlement, but had no other financial means really, and really did need to sell this house. And so we said, well, we'll move back. We'll help you. We were paying her rent, but it was less than what we were paying at the other place. But that helped us get kind of our finances in order by paying down our credit card debt, and also starting to save for our own house, because we knew that when she sold, we were going to need another housing option. And actually, we ended up house hacking without knowing that's what it was called, because when she sold her house, we bought a house, but she used the equity in her home, because that was when as long as you used the equity from your home and bought another home, you didn't have to pay tax. That was the old tax rule. So she technically was a co-owner of the house with us. So we actually didn't even need to put a down payment down. We took the mortgage, she put the down payment, and then a couple of years later, she moved out to her own place because she was ready to just jump in and buy something else right away. And we were like, don't do that. Come live with us. We'll make it work for everyone. And then a couple of years later, we basically bought her out and she bought her own place. So we were house hackers before house hacking became a thing.
Yeah, I know. And that's like the grandma or the mama house hack, which I hadn't heard of yet. A thought came to mind I have to bring up, because it sounds like you lived a little bit of a Caddyshack and Fast Times at Ridgemont High life. Would that be true?
Yeah. I like that. I'll have to use that.
Were you Spagoli?
I don't really remember the movie that well, but we definitely, I think we fit that to some degree. Yeah.
Well, you were the caddy and she was the lifeguard. It's perfect. It was a match made in heaven.
Yeah. Well, and our last names were or are the same. So that's actually how we met. And Trautman is not a common name at all, but we met because we had the same last name. Someone said, hey, you need to meet this other person. She's a new lifeguard. She has the same last name. And actually, she lived about 2 miles down the road. And we used to get each other's mail all the time. And this was before we knew each other. And we're like, oh, you're that other Trautman. Okay, I get it.
So she didn't have to change her name, or did she?
Well, she actually had 2 N's on the end and I had 1. So we joked that maybe we should just both have 3.
Or you could hyphenate.
Yeah. And our mothers have the same birthday too, which is also really weird, but not same year, same day though.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, a lot of strange stuff.
You had a match made in heaven. You had a life that was fulfilling and goal-oriented. Although things didn't work out the way you thought they would, did they?
No. Yeah. So I retired early and we figured, this is going to be our time to do all these great things. And we did a number of things, but she was diagnosed with cancer in 2019, had a number of, successful surgeries, and was deemed clean twice, as a matter of fact, cancer-free. And then it ended up going to her brain and taking her life, unfortunately. But that was about a 2-year battle of that, back and forth of good news, bad news.
And the battle you had was actually shared with the Phi community. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a member of the Phi community during this battle that your wife had with cancer.
Yeah, so actually, I live in Crested Butte, which is a very small ski town, about 4 hours west of Denver. And most of her treatments were in the Denver area. And after the first, she had sarcoma, so they removed a lump on her arm. And then immediately they were like, okay, so you're going to start radiation treatment. And it's 7 weeks every day, 5 days a week. And we're like, okay, well, when does that start? They're like, well, next week. And we're like, we live 4 hours away. How are we going to do that? They're like, well, you better figure it out because you need to be here and you need to do this. So I reached out to the Choose FI Denver group and said, hey, does anyone have anywhere we could stay? And literally the flood of people that came that said, I have a room, I have a place, all kinds of stuff. And so we ended up meeting our good friend Amberly Grant now that way. She had a Airbnb that was available, that she had just bought this property and was going to Airbnb the downstairs, and said, hey, I'd be happy for you guys to stay there. Of course, we compensated her. We weren't looking for anything for free. That was just a sign of how giving this community is. And we've become great friends as a result of that initial meeting back in 2019.
So, Mark, in preparing for your wife's passing, were there specific financial considerations that you were even able to wrap your head around?
Well, while she was sick for 2 years, I don't really think we ever really were preparing for that day, because we always assumed she was going to get better. So a lot of the things that I had to deal with afterwards were more after the fact. And so we didn't do a lot of preparation. The only thing I would say that we kind of did was that she was working primarily for health insurance, and she decided, I asked her, because we had kind of decided that we were both going to retire at the same time. She said, my job is pretty easy. I kind of like the people I work with. I'd like to keep doing it. And besides, we have this great health insurance. Why don't I just keep doing that, as long as they allow me the flexibility that I would like for vacations and things like that? Why don't we just keep doing that? And then when she got sick, she was adamant about, hey, I don't want to rock the boat. I want to keep this health insurance. So she stayed working as long as she could. And in hindsight, though, because I have switched over to the ACA after she passed away and that health insurance went away, we would have been fine if we were on the ACA to begin with. Actually, the coverage is great, and I haven't had any issues. And even all of her doctors that she was using were in network anyway. So actually, in hindsight, I think it probably would have been better if we just said, be done, don't worry about this, and let's just go over to the ACA. So in hindsight, I wish we kind of had done that instead of having her continuing to work, even though it wasn't that hard of a job.
So it was the financial stress of not knowing the unknown with regards to her illness and health insurance that kept you in a situation that, in retrospect, you'd have let the insurance go, retired, and gone off on your dreams and goals that you still shared.
Yeah, I think, knowing now what I know about the ACA, I think we probably should have just both retired at the same time and been done. And that would have given us a couple of years before she even got sick, because I left in the end of 2015. So I was really at the beginning of 2016. And she wasn't diagnosed until 2019. So that would have been 3 full years of being able to do a lot more than we did. Although we always did do a lot of travel and pretty much could do almost anything we wanted, but there was work still there that she had to complete.
That's interesting. That's probably the second time recently that I've heard that kind of comment about the ACA. I've not had to have any dealings with it, because we went from the employer coverage to COBRA to Medicare. So we didn't have a gap that we had to fill for Stephen and I. And I think I would be intimidated by the ACA and trying to figure it out and assuming that it wasn't going to cover what I needed and all that. So it's good to know that it's not a hurdle that can't be overcome.
I mean, cost can be the factor, really, is what it boils down to. So if you can figure out your income in such a way that you get a subsidy, that would be, beneficial. But had we paid full freight, which we would have, and we had budgeted for it, but, it can be $1,500 to, it's depending, what state you live in, what zip code you live in, and so forth. But for us, and my daughter at the time was a dependent, so for us, it probably would have been pretty close to $2,000 a month. So it's a big number for a lot of people.
So, Mark, what other types of financial issues did you discover or deal with after the fact? Because you had these plans and goals as a couple, and now suddenly you're single. So what kinds of things changed for you financially?
Well, the biggest ones you think about is, are your expenses going to change? So I still live in the same house and still have the same vehicles, or old, 2 old vehicles with almost 200,000 miles. So that didn't change. And, I'm, kind of a spreadsheet geek. So I do track everything, and it has been almost 2 years now. And I was interested to see how much my expenses would really change. And they only dropped by about 10%. So there really wasn't this big drop in expenses. And then what you do end up finding out is that your tax bracket changes, right? So in the year of death, you're still able to file married filing joint, which we did. And then the year after, or up to 2 years after, if you have a dependent child, which I did because she was still in school and under the age of 24, but only for one of those 2 years, I could file as what's called qualifying widow or widower. I think it's actually called qualifying spouse now because of not widow, widower, which allows you to basically file in the married filing joint category. But then the following year is single. So this year is single for me. And your tax brackets drop in half. So we had this kind of long runway where we had planned on doing Roth conversions and things like that in the married filing joint bracket, but that's kind of now gone. So now I can still do Roth conversions and the assets are the same because I inherited her assets. So we still have the same dollars to convert, but yet I'm now converting them in the single bracket. So it's a much higher, you get through those brackets a lot quicker. So that's been one of the biggest challenges. And then now with Secure 2.0, I'm not only thinking about, well, what is my tax situation going to be, but what is my daughter's tax situation going to be if she inherits this from me? And we were probably very similar to some of your listeners, very heavy in the tax deferred bucket. So traditional 401k, traditional IRA, which is fully taxable. And if those assets are left to my daughter, she will need to withdraw from those accounts or empty those accounts within 10 years. And that may be at the same time she has a high income potentially, because that's often when people do inherit, they're in their highest income years. So now I'm starting to think not only what is my tax situation going to be going forward, but what is my daughter's if she ends up inheriting. And this is something, called 210 by Jim Saulnier of the Retirement and IRA show. He coined that term, which is basically, are you planning for two of you, which would be married, right? One of you, and that would be the widow, widower, or if you're just single to begin with, or divorced, for instance, or are you planning for zero, your inheritors? So I think a lot about that now. And then also there are some things that you can do, which I did after she passed away. So for instance, you get a step up in basis on her half of the assets that are in a taxable brokerage account, for example, but also on the value of the home. And we live in a high cost of living area. Our home is worth quite a bit. So what I did was I had a valuation done on the house. So I got the value as of the date of death, because that's when it has to be done, and then get the step up in basis on her half of the house if I were to sell it. But also you can basically fill out Form 706, which is the estate tax return, and basically say, so each person right now gets about $12.8 million in tax exemption for your estate when you pass it to somebody else. And you can basically make use of your spouse's unused portion, which is the deceased spouse unused exclusion, but you have to file to do that. So we did that, or I did that. So I could utilize any of her unused 12.8 million down the road, because if, let's say, the 12.8 million goes to one, there was leftover from her that I could use, and my estate could use that, and so forth. So it's some paperwork, and that was some things I learned after the fact that I wasn't as well versed in. But so those are some things.
Well, that sounds great. And it also sounds a little complicated. In your most recent post, you actually recommended 2 or 3 books to help people navigate these areas if they want to, because we can't cover the scope here in our simple podcast.
Yeah. So the one book is After the Death of Your Spouse by Mike Piper. Great book. It's only about 100 pages. And it outlines basically everything you need to do from a financial perspective after your spouse passes away. And I would say it's not just for spouses. It could be for your parents or helping anyone with their estate, really. And these are kind of what you need to do now, what you don't need to do right away, but what you should do at some point. Highly recommend that book. If you have like a in case of emergency, or, kind of the ice binder, I would just stick it in there for anyone who needs to go through that. So that's good. And then what I've been doing now, and we might get into that, is, how do you live your life going forward? And I think the book Die with Zero is a good book for thinking about that. And then just thinking about, living your life to its fullest. Jordan Grumek's book, Taking Stock, is another excellent book. So those are three great books in kind of this sphere.
Well, you talk a lot about your daughter. Let's circle back to her for a minute, because you're not really one, you're two. How has your approach to finances had an impact on her with her financial development? How did you do it? How'd you get it right? How'd you get it wrong? What do we need to do, especially as late starters who may have not shown our kids the right way to do things? How do we bring them around?
Yeah, so we always involved her in the conversation. She was always fully aware of what we were doing from a financial standpoint. For example, when we sold the house, we lived in New York for a period of time, just over the border of New Jersey. That's where we bought the big house. If you want to read about it, it's on my blog, Mark's Money Mind. It's called Who Let That Creep In? Was that what it's called? Anyway, it's about building a big house and letting who let the lifestyle creep in, or something like that. But anyway, when we sold this house, here's this, basically third grader, like, Mommy and Daddy, why are we selling the house? Is everything okay? And like, no, here's why we're doing it from a financial perspective. This is what makes sense. This is what we're doing. Because we moved in from this 5,000 square foot house to like a 1,500 square foot rental. And most kids would be like, oh my God, is the world crumbling? What's going on? Did you lose your jobs? We're like, no, this was purely a financial decision. This is why we did it. So we always included her in on those decisions. I don't know that she was totally on board with the idea, but at least she understood why we did it. And then one of the things, so when we spoke at Camp 5 recently, she spoke as well and about some of her money lessons. And one of the biggest lessons she said at that meeting was, we went to Disney World and they're bombarded with just, buy this, right? So one of the tips we got was give your kid an allowance and allow them to spend that, but only that, right? And so day one, here's your $10, and we go into this store and there's a Tigger backpack that she loves, has to have, right? It's $80, I think it was, or something crazy like that. And we said, well, we're going to be here long enough that you would have enough by the end, and she's like, well, why don't you just buy it now? And then, no, that's not how it's going to work. So she ended up saving enough of her money throughout the whole course of our trip and buying only $1 or $2 items along the way so that she would have enough at the end. And she ended up buying that Tigger backpack, and she actually brought it to the presentation and showed everybody. So it obviously had a big impact, but, delayed gratification, maybe giving them an allowance, which she always have. And we always were big fans of saying if she wanted something big, she had to contribute. So, and she takes care of her things now because of that, I think. So having skin in the game. And then one of the other big lesson that I think we taught her, and she was involved in seeing this kind of over the course of time, was when she was born, I kind of thought about how much money do we need to save in a college education account. And I kind of backed into this number of $500 a month from the day she was born every month until she was 18 as enough for a state school. And so we did that. But along the way, as she became kind of in elementary school, grade school, we started showing her what that account was doing, what it was there for, how we were saving. She was seeing the compounding. And then when she got into her high school years, we said, okay, here's what the account is. And it had grown a lot more than we expected. So she had more than enough to go to a state school, probably enough to almost go to an Ivy League school. But we told her, this is your account. And if you spend it all on a Ivy League school, and if it costs more, you have to figure it out. But if you spend less, you get to keep the difference. And this is your head start in life. And she chose a state school and ended up using only half of it. And actually, she just, as Becky mentioned, is a graduate student and graduating this May. And actually, half of that account paid for all 5 years, including graduate school. And she basically has half left over to start life with. And we've also done things like, helped her with her contributing to her Roth IRA and stuff since she started working. So she's seen all of that and is, well steeped in this world right now.
A lot of folks may not know exactly what you mean about contributing to a child's Roth IRA. Can you take us through that to help others out?
Yeah. So the account that we were saving for her initially was a UTMA account. So that's Uniform Transfer to Minors Act. So basically a brokerage account. that you are the custodian for, but the child is the owner of the account. And once the money goes in that account, it's considered a completed gift. So it's their money. And they have use of it as of the age of majority, which in some states is 18 and others is 21. But basically, once she started working in her, I think she was maybe 14 or something like that. She maybe made, I don't know, $2,000 for the summer. And we said, hey, you know what you can do is you can fund your Roth IRA because you have earnings and you have this brokerage account, which literally we could move money from the brokerage account over into the Roth IRA because you already have the money. So we didn't even have to write the check. Now, some parents may say, okay, if a child makes, $2,000 in the summer, we'll match, 50 cents on the dollar, just like a 401k, or maybe we'll even make the whole contribution. But basically, the money that goes into the Roth IRA doesn't have to be the child's money, that their own money necessarily. It can be parent, a grandparent, whomever. They just have to have the earnings equivalent to be able to make that contribution. So for us, we weren't even actually making the contribution. We were just saying, hey, it might make more sense instead of the money sitting in your custodial account to be over in your Roth IRA. And then she's been doing that ever since she started working. So
I hadn't heard of that one. That's a great hack. I really like that hack. Thanks a lot.
Mark, you and I have had several conversations about 529s for kids, and we've recently set up 529s even for our grandchildren. So can you just give us a quick overview of what a 529 does?
Sure. A 529 is basically a college savings program, and they're usually state run. So your state may also have a tax deduction for contributing to a 529 account in your state. There is no federal tax deduction, but the money that you put in basically acts like a retirement account where the earnings grow tax-free. And if the money taken out of the account is for a qualified education purpose, which is tuition, room and board, books, even computers that are required for school, for example, those are all qualified expenses. So you can take money out of that account to pay for those costs once they reach higher education. And now actually, I think up to $10,000 can be used for K through 12 in some states, not in our state, but in some states. And now also because of Secure 2.0, there's the ability, if there's money left over in those accounts, that money could be used starting in 2024 to fund the Roth IRA of the beneficiary. There's some qualifications, like the account has to be open for 15 years. They can't be contributions from within the last 5 years. And there's a number of other things. But basically, you could use it to fund the beneficiary's Roth IRA up to $35,000, but still subject to the same income limits. They can't just dump 35,000 into their Roth IRA. They would still need to have enough earned income and meet those annual amounts before you could put the whole 35 in. But there are more exit points for 529 than there used to be.
That's another great hack. And actually, with regards to grandparents and 529s, my understanding is you can front load 10 years of contributions and then just let it sit and grow.
Yeah. And so actually for my daughter's 529, there's money left over. And so what we've decided to do is let it stay there. So she is currently the beneficiary. But if she were to have children down the road, you can change the beneficiary to anyone who's related to the beneficiary. So I can change it to a a child born in the future. Let me correct that, Katie, unless you're listening. Not soon to be. But,
be careful of accusing women to be pregnant.
But anyway, so if she were to have a child way down the road, we could change the beneficiary to that child. And so in the meantime, this money is sitting there and growing. So that's another, so you could basically start a 529 with yourself as the custodian and the beneficiary for a child that you don't even have yet, and then just name the child once that child happens.
Well, that's the power of the 529 for our ever more expensive educational expenses. Is you can create a wealth building machine for education. You don't have to spend it all on your children. And actually, if you're able to, create it for your family in perpetuum.
Yeah, because the relationship test for the beneficiaries is very, very broad. So it's very easy to switch to nieces, nephews, grandchildren, what have you.
Next door neighbors.
If they have some relation, I would say, but I don't know just a regular next door neighbor.
Well, Trautman to Trautman, I was getting.
There you go. There
Cousins.
you go.
All right, Mark, you talked about the future. I think it's always good to end with the future. You've gone through a lot. Your dreams, your goals, your life, it's all changed. It's you and your daughter, your community of 5 friends, your community in Crested Butte. What does life look like for you now? And what are your dreams for the future? Where are you going with your retirement?
So what I've really enjoyed doing is kind of being involved in this financial independence community. I've made a whole bunch of friends, you guys included, and spending time with those people in all different areas of the country, whether it's a financial independence event or just traveling in general. We have some trips coming up or just general travel or just, hey, let's go do something together. So that's what I look forward to. I've had to learn how to spend because initially I was a spender, right? And then I became this super saver. And now I'm trying to relearn how to spend again. So I have this thing called a fun bucket, which a friend of mine helped create. He said, because I wasn't spending, I was spending well below what, the 4% rule or 3% rule would say you could. And I was way below that. And he's like, what you need is a fun bucket. So what that is taking some money and putting it over into a separate account that allows you to spend on things that you wouldn't ordinarily spend on. So some of these things might be, well, for instance, I'm going back east for a week and I decided to upgrade to first class. I did think about it back and forth for a couple of days, but I ultimately did buy that ticket. It wasn't a substantial upcharge. It was like $300, but still you can see how spending is still a little bit of a challenge, or doing big trips. Like Becky and I are actually going to be on 2 of these trips this year. One is to Alaska and one is to Bali. So that's definitely fun bucket spending. That's way out of ordinary spending. So that's really kind of what's coming up. I like to say this is the year of fun. I have something planned every month for the year. That's something, it's kind of goes back to the Die with Zero book, creating lasting memories with friends. So experiences, not things. And then they create memory dividends that you will enjoy for the rest of your life. So that's kind of the goal this year and hopefully goals for many years going forward.
Well, you also give back in your community with regards to financial literacy. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. So I was asked to help teach a financial literacy course that was originally a junior achievement course about 7 years ago in the high school. I thought what they were using was a little juvenile. So I said, do you mind if I kind of add some stuff? I did that in the class I was teaching. There were 2 other volunteers that were doing it as well. And then the following year, or the summer prior to the following year, the guidance counselor who runs the course or runs the program said, yeah, next year we'd like to do your program. So do you mind writing a curriculum going forward? And also, by the way, you need to write it so other people can teach it. So I spent the summer doing that. And then now actually the other 2 volunteers kind of backed out because they said, we think the students would be better off if you taught all the classes and you obviously have the time to do it. Would you be willing to do it? And I was like, absolutely. So for the last 7 years, I've been teaching a financial literacy class to the high schoolers. They're all seniors. They're willing to listen because they know they're going out into the real world like right away. So they are avid listeners. And actually yesterday or day before, I was at career day and I was like, what am I going to talk about? I have no career, right? I'm retired. But anyway, so I was at career day and I had a chance to talk to a bunch of the students that were in the class and they really, really liked the class. And I said, don't BS me. Tell me whether it's valuable. And they said, absolutely. Everyone should get this class. So I'm so happy to be able to do that.
And it seems though that not only are the high school seniors benefiting from this, but it spills out onto others also. I think has had an effect on even parents and other teachers.
Yeah. So one year I was asked to the teachers, I noticed they were sitting in the back of the class occasionally. I'm like, what's going on with these people in the back of the class? And they're like, oh, they're here because they want to hear it too. And then the principal was there one day and I was like, oh, now I'm in trouble because I don't have, I was like, am I going to get in trouble because I created this curriculum? What's going on? And they said, no, she just wanted to see what the course was about. And then afterwards she asked, would you be willing to do this for the teachers? So I came up with a little course for them one year. And then sometimes I do stuff with parents, we'll have nights where we talk about 529s or what have you. So small community. So people now know, they just call me or see me in the street and say, hey, can we talk about this?
It sounds like you should put your curriculum together and help the rest of the country that seems to be falling further and further behind with their financial education.
Well, actually, I did put it, I have been asked by a number of people to do that. So it is on my blog right now. You can actually see the whole course. I don't charge or anything. It's free. It's basically what I recorded in 2020. During COVID, I had to do classes over Zoom. So I was like, well, I can just put those up there. So I did. Those are up there. The handouts are up there. So if you go to Mark's Money Mind and look for a financial literacy course, you'll see it. It's all there.
That's very generous of you. We're interested, too, in closing with what specific tips, hacks, or tricks you might have for late starters like us that are faced with catching up to FI.
Well, I think the hardest part for people that are later in their lives is that they have everything kind of set. They're set in their ways, right? So it's hard to make a change in your housing, your transportation, maybe your food, but those are actually the biggest factors, and those will move the needle the most. So I think, having a real thoughtful discussion and conversation with your partner, if you have one, about can we move the needle on some of those bigger things? And I think, Bill, you actually did downsize or relocate at one point, right? If I'm correct.
Yeah, we live the fat life in Chicago in the fat house, not quite 5,000 square feet, but close. And we accidentally geo-arbitraged to Tennessee, but still built another house. And then since then, we've downsized into our pre-retirement, work the plan, mid-plan house.
But that probably had a bigger impact than just cutting out the lattes, for example, right?
Being debt-free and owning our 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, which is 2,500 square feet, has been one of the best things we've done. I recommend it. It's one of the hardest things we've done. It is not easy, but it is a big rock. And once you move it, you'll see a huge difference.
Right. So I like, Ramit Sethi from I Will Teach You to Be Rich says, think about the $30,000 decisions, not the $3 decisions. And while they are the hardest, they are the ones that will potentially move you forward the quickest, potentially. And then I would just say, be willing to walk a different path than other people. We always did. That never really bothered us. And we always had friends like, I don't understand why you guys aren't, interested in going out to dinner as much or, doing these fancy things. And we're like, yeah, it's just not our thing. And we were fine with that. And as long as we both were fine with that worked out. If one of us was single, it would probably have been a harder environment to kind of walk your own walk. But I would say it's okay to be different. And there are a lot of people that are different in communities like this that you can then befriend, and you will find that you are no longer different.
Well, how do people reach you personally, Mark? So if they want to ask you questions, I know you've opened yourself up to this before, but you have a wealth of knowledge that you're willing to share. How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I do have a blog. I don't post a lot, but there is a contact page, so you can email me through that. So that's marksmoneymind.com. I'm also on Facebook under my regular name, Mark Trautman, and that's with an A. I think the O is a minister somewhere out in Virginia or something, but I'm the only Mark Trautman. That's Trautman. I guess I have a thing on Instagram. I don't really post over there very much, but that's under Mark's Money Mind. So basically look for me under Mark's Money Mind or Mark Trautman, and you'll pretty much find me anywhere. And I go to a lot of Camp FI events. So I'll be in Mid-Atlantic, Rocky Mountain, and Midwest this year. So maybe if I see you there, that'd be great. Certainly look for me. I'll be at those.
This is not the last you'll hear from Mark. When Mark and Becky go on their trip to Alaska, they're going to be with a lot of financially minded people, and he's going to be a guest host on Catching Up to FI.
Looking forward to that.
That's right. Well, thanks so much for being here today. And we've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure that there's more to come.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I really love what you guys are doing. Keep it up.
Thank you, Mark.
So, Mark, go over Brad Clontze's money quadrants with us, just in case we hadn't heard of those before.
Yeah, so he calls them money scripts, and it's Dr. Bradley Klontz. He was the founder of Financial Psychology Institute. And actually, Joe Saul-Sehy, who just wrote the book Stacked, he has a whole chapter in there about this. So if you're interested in kind of learning the details, he summarizes it pretty well in that chapter. But basically, there's 4 quadrants. There's money avoidance, there's money worship, there's money status, and there's money vigilance. And the way they're described is money avoidance is negative ideas about wealth and money. So in other words, you just like don't want anything to do with money. You think it's evil. Money worship is more money is the solution to problems. So, if I just make more money, everything will be great, which we know isn't always true, right? Money status is, and this is where my family, I would say, kind of fell into this quadrant, I would suspect, prioritize outward displays of income and wealth. So in other words, what you wear on your sleeve is your, self-worth or net worth. Which we know is not necessarily the truth, but that's what money status is. And lastly, people that are in the FI community probably fall into this quadrant, which is money vigilance, alert, watchful, and concerned about financial health. And sometimes to a degree that's too much and potentially detrimental, right? Overly concerned about these things. But those are the 4 quadrants of the money scripts by Dr. Bradley Klontz, the founder of the Financial Psychology Institute.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to 5. We would appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
We are not lawyers, financial advisors, accountants, or tax experts. Please consult your own professional advisors before making any important decisions. Our content is for entertainment and education purposes only.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to 5.